This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Rafael Rodriguez. Dr. Rodriguez teaches New Testament at Pittsburg Theological Seminary and is the author of several books and articles. He is a contributor to The Next Quest for the Historical Jesus, out now on Eerdmans Press, where he penned a chapter entitled Ancient Media, which explores what variations in ancient media, in particular oral tradition, can tell us about the nature of the Gospels and their presentations of Jesus. We will be discussing this chapter on the show today. Dr. Rodriguez, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
I'm really excited to talk to you today. It turns out that like Chris Keith, you and I have kind of a similar background. We went to the same college, not at the same time, but we were at the same school here. So that's really cool. But other than that, tell us about yourself, your background, your work, how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, well, it's funny that my interest in grad school and seminary really was on the later New Testament, and that's where I wanted to focus. Texts that were written towards the end of the first century, early second century, and I wasn't particularly interested in the Gospels and even the historical Jesus because I just had this sense that there were all these things that I didn't really understand. What is a cue and how does it work? And when I read this text in Matthew, am I supposed to know if it has a parallel in Mark or Luke or whatever? So I was just trying to stay clear of all of that stuff. And one day I was in my advisor's office complaining about how next semester there are no classes in the New Testament being offered. There's all these classes that I'm not interested in, but there's only one New Testament class called The Life and Teachings of Jesus, and that's not really relevant to what I want to study in ministry. I said those words, and my advisor just blinked at me, and as I heard them fade in his office, I was like, not that the life and teachings of my Lord and Savior aren't relevant to what I want to study in seminary. And he kept blinking. And so as an act of penance, I took Life and Teachings of Jesus. And it was fascinating. I loved the exploration of the history of the era, learning about Second Temple Judaism, learning about these weird people who are out in the desert writing and secreting scrolls into caves. And also realized that historians weren't just out to debunk the foundations of the Christian faith. They were actually trying to understand the processes that led from or that connected the life and teachings of this person who's walking around, attracting crowds, teaching, but also doing some weird things, healings and exorcising demons, feeding people with just a little tiny bit of food. And historians are trying to understand, how did we get from this guy walking around in the early first century to these texts that we have written in the mid to late first century? And what are the things that we can be confident about? What are the things that we know the texts say, but there are questions about how did this work or did that really happen? To those places where we're like, I really suspect that didn't happen. And as a young student, that last category was the one that would make my teeth itch a little bit. Like, well, what do you mean that didn't happen? If it's in the Bible, of course it happened. But that was the part that I had to face. That look, it's not all about proving or disproving faith. It's actually about trying to understand this thing that has affected the lives of millions, maybe even billions of people. So I started studying the gospel, studying the historical Jesus, pursued a PhD, and life has just gone on from there.
That's perfect. Well, and that was a great segue to my next question. I want to ask you about the motivation that you had to contribute to the Next Quest. One of the things that's really interesting that you brought up in your answer to my first question was the fact that a lot of what we're doing has to do with method. We're going to be talking about that a lot today. So how do we read the Gospels? How do we understand the Gospels and the information that they give us about Jesus? And I had one commenter on my interview on James Crosley. I had one commenter on YouTube who was like, you guys didn't even talk about Jesus at all. And I was like, well, that kind of misses the point of the Next Quest, because in a lot of ways it really is all about method. Like how do we utilize the sources that we have, and in what kind of angles historically can we use to look at Jesus as he was in history? So I want you to talk about your involvement in that. What motivated you to participate in the Next Quest?
Yeah. Well, so before my act of penance, taking the life and teachings of Jesus, my master's thesis was on First Peter, and I got really interested in this thing that sociologists were talking about, and some biblical scholars were beginning to talk about, called social identity theory, which looks at the way group membership, our embeddedness in particular groups. I am a Cincinnati Bengals fan, or I am an American, or I am, whatever. The groups that we belong in affect how we think of ourselves and how we enact and enact our identity and interact with other people. So I was really interested in social identity theory. As I was taking that Life and Teachings of Jesus class, my professor says, you need to think about this thing called social memory theory. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. Had no idea what it was. But what I thought social memory theory might offer us was a way through the impasse. As I said, there were some historians who are trying to understand who Jesus is and how the Gospels reveal him to us. And then there were some historians who were highly skeptical of the Gospels and their ability to tell us anything meaningful at all about Jesus. And I thought, hey, I'll bet social memory theory, just because my professor tells me this, I'll bet social memory theory has some way of getting us beyond this impasse. And so I dove right in. And kind of quickly, within the first 6 months, I would say, I realized that's not what social memory theory does. Social memory theory doesn't prove or disprove that a thing happened. Social memory theory, which I guess I didn't explain. Social memory theory is similar to social identity theory in that it examines how our membership in particular groups influences how we remember the past. So like as Americans, I can throw out certain dates that are going to be meaningful to everybody: 1776, 1861 to 1865, 1964. These are years that mean things to us because we're Americans. And then there are whole swaths of time that mean nothing. So if I throw out a year 1848, that means nothing to most Americans. 1848, have no idea. Where if I'm a European, 1848 is an incredibly momentous year. And so my location in a different group is going to affect the texture of the past. Anyway, so I'm exploring social memory theory and how it might help us think about the historical Jesus. And I realized it doesn't answer the questions. Social memory theory doesn't answer the questions I wanted it to answer, but it does really throw into relief how the importance of how the earliest followers of Jesus formed groups and developed a culture of gathering together, of living together, of sharing sacred stories, reading Israel's sacred texts, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, these things, and also how telling and enacting stories of Jesus' life, whether we're just getting together to remember the things he did. Well, remember the time Jesus did this and interacted with this guy and healed his daughter, or remember the time that Jesus, some people came and tried to test him and they asked him this question and he had this awesome answer. And just telling those stories, or just the act of ritually gathering and eating a meal, and in our minds, because a lot of this is cognitive, in our minds, as we're eating, we're thinking about Jesus. This food in some way brings Jesus near to me, even inside of me. This wine in some way represents not just nourishment for my body, but also the blood that he shed for me. And these things, these ideas affected the way people remembered the past. And so if we're going to understand these texts that were produced by the early followers of Jesus and their interactions, we've got to understand something about their culture, the significance of the way they live together in groups, and so that's and that's not the kind of thing I saw happening in historical Jesus scholarship. Historical Jesus scholarship at the time was very much more, in the early 21st century, was very much more focused on, let's divide these texts up into very small pieces, and then examine each piece, and then set it down and move on to the next piece, and then set it down and move on to the next piece. And so I was like, I don't think that method, which is the word you used earlier, I don't think that method gets us where we want to go. So I think we need to stop doing that, not do it better, but stop doing that, and we need to start answering some different questions. At the time, I thought what I was doing was innovative, but it turns out there are actually dozens of people around the world who were having these same kinds of complaints. Some of them, like me, were young and upcoming. Some of them were established and had kind of a long history of thinking that something new was different. And what James Crossley and Chris Keith put together is a bunch of us who have different ideas about how to move forward, but we all kind of basically agree that the way we learned to do it in the second half of the 20th century didn't actually get us closer to knowing about Jesus and how he lived in the world. And so we need some new ways of talking about these things, which was an exciting project to be a part of.
Yeah, and again, it came together really well. It's a very diverse array of scholars. It's not necessarily all moving in the same direction,
That's right.
so to speak. There's kind of a lot of different paths to take, and I think that that's why it's such an important representation of the direction that Jesus scholarship is headed in. I think that your article did a great job of talking about the problems of ancient media, and this is something that, like when I was in ministry, I had a really hard time explaining to the people in my church because there are so many Christians that are locked into the ideas that when you open up your Bible, there are 4 written gospels, and these are our only primary sources about Jesus. Like it's the Jesus tradition begins and ends with the 4 gospels that are recorded in the Christian scripture. But you claim in the very opening of your chapter in the Next Quest, and I have the quote here, you claim that the Next Quest must account for the irreducibility of the early Jesus tradition to handwritten text. And the idea behind this statement is that it's not just about the written text. There's more to it than that. So why do we need to look beyond the written text to find information about Jesus?
Yeah, that's great. And on the one hand, I want to start by acknowledging that the people in your pews, their instinct that we have these 4 written accounts of the story of Jesus, and that these are our primary sources, and that's it. They're more right than they are wrong. I mean, the Gospels are something like 90% of the data that we have about Jesus, and even those things that don't come from the Gospels are evaluated against the gospel. So what Josephus has to say about Jesus, or what Tacitus or Suetonius have to say about Jesus, which actually is basically nothing, is evaluated against the gospels. What Paul has to say, most of it isn't even attributed to Jesus. And it's just, this sounds like Matthew. I wonder if Paul's getting this from Jesus. But if we didn't have Matthew, we would have or Matthew or Luke or whatever, we would have no idea that Paul is echoing things that Jesus taught. So I want to stress that kind of commonsensical view isn't wrong, but I'm trying to think of a useful metaphor here. We're all we all can kind of imagine in our minds the ruins of an ancient village, right? You can see the outline of walls, but they're all just, a couple inches to a couple feet high. Certainly, and the ruins of an ancient village don't include walls that go up 6, 8, 10 feet, and then a roof and all that. All of that's gone. But when we walk in, we don't go, hey, look at this. Ancient people lived in houses whose walls only extended about 3 feet high, and they didn't have roofs. How did they live like that? We understand that there's more there than survives today. There had to be. Of course there were. The whole point of ancient houses, housing even today, is to protect us from the elements. And so a house with no roof is not a house at all. But I think the way that scholars have examined the Gospels has been a bit like describing an ancient house in terms of the physical remains today, and ignoring the bit above the walls that clearly existed, even if we don't know exactly what they look like. And so I think it would be a bit like, and I hope this isn't too gruesome or macabre to share on your podcast, but it would be a bit like discovering again, I hope this isn't too much, but like discovering a severed arm somewhere and then trying to examine, what does this arm do just in terms of the remains of that arm? Well, it's got this pivot point in the middle, and it's got these things on the end, but it stops right here and all that. And if you don't understand that what we're looking at is part of something much larger, you misunderstand what it is. So sadly, we don't have not one syllable of ancient oral Jesus tradition, just none at all. And so the people who think we've got to focus on the texts are exactly right. But how we focus on the texts, we have to acknowledge that these texts had vibrant connections, like the base of an ancient house's wall, or like an arm, had vibrant connections to other things, and that those connections are hugely important to how the thing that we do have functioned, right? We can't read, say, Matthew's rewriting of a story from Luke and think all we're seeing here is evidence for how Matthew, a scholar like me, sat down with Mark, a text like something I have in my hand, and looked at words and then edited those words to make his own version. he had connections to, he had a history of telling stories about Jesus. He had interactions with people. He had told the story of Jesus before in ways, sometimes perhaps those ways failed. The audience left going, I appreciate you trying in today's church service, but your sermon wasn't very good. He had other times that were great. He could tell that the audience was really responding well. And those would affect the way that he told the story. So it wasn't just, well, Matthew sees Mark and wishes Mark had said this, and so Matthew makes Mark say that. He's got all kinds of other connections that we just don't have. Since we don't have them, we can't really analyze them. But that doesn't mean we can pretend like they didn't exist. That would be like looking at an ancient wall and thinking it only rose 2 feet high, or a severed arm and thinking this was just an arm and had no connection to a body. I don't know if does that make sense?
No, that's really perfect. And this has kind of been the long-standing quest for the so-called historical Jesus, even going back to like D.F. Strauss, who essentially postulated that everything in the Gospels was mythology. But then that opened up the question, well, how do we get the Gospels in the first place? And so there had to be something, so quote unquote, behind the Gospels, which is, I know that a term that like Chris Keith and some other people are trying to push back against that. But the predominant paradigm during the 20th century was form criticism. And that was associated with the so-called new quest for the historical Jesus. But even with the third quest, a lot of scholars within that camp still utilize the methods of form criticism for their analysis of the historical Jesus. So I think before we proceed, maybe talk about form criticism and how it worked. Like what is the method of form criticism, and how was that designed to help us kind of get behind the Gospels to the historical Jesus?
Yeah. Form criticism really has kind of two major components. I mean, it's a lot more complicated than that, but we can boil it down, I think, to two major components. And the first one is literary, and this one's not particularly controversial. If you read through the Gospels, particularly the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but also the fourth Gospel, John, you read through the Gospels, you're going to notice that you have kind of recurrent types of stories. Here's a parable, there's a parable, there's a parable, and they seem to have these themes in common, or these ideas in common. A lot of them cluster together, and so those are particularly similar. I think in Matthew 13, you get a lot of parables that begin to "What shall I compare the kingdom of heaven?" or "What is it like?" and then you get a short story. But even beyond those very clear similarities, you can look at stories across different texts and go, these stories are similar, and these stories are similar, and these stories are similar. So it's a bit like when you're putting together a puzzle. It's a bit like. One of the first things you might do is separate the pieces by color. And, the pieces that are predominantly red, you put them in a pile. The pieces that are predominantly yellow, you put them in a pile. And so form criticism was really just trying to do that. Let's bring these like stories together and offer a literary analysis. What does a controversy story look like? What does a healing story look like? What does a pronouncement story look like? And that's not particularly controversial. Where things begin to get a little bit stickier is that second idea in form criticism, which was especially prominent in German form criticism, where form criticism had its birth and early development, which was that we could then analyze these stories historically. That parables come from a particular setting in the early groups. I was talking before about early groups. Form criticism was trying to do something similar here, that the early groups told parables to accomplish particular things, or the early Christians told pronouncement stories in order to accomplish particular things. And so these stories had their origins in certain settings, the German word is Sitzenleben or Sitzenleben. It's the settings in life, the situation in life. And so as early Christians are preaching to non-believers, they need a certain kind of story, and it would develop in that setting. Or as early Christians gathered to worship, they needed a certain kind of story, and those stories would kind of develop. And so form criticism analyze the different kinds of stories historically in order to find out, does this story come from those settings in the early church, or do they come from a setting in the life of Jesus? Perhaps unsurprisingly, most most form critics said, well, the stories work really well in early Christian environments. And so most of the stories come from those early Christian environments. They don't come from the life of Jesus. And that's I think that's a pretty decent 5-minute introduction to form criticism. One last point, though, is that as early as the 1960s, but particularly as we get into the 70s and then jump ahead into the 90s and early 2000s, you had a lot of people, particularly in the English-speaking world and in Scandinavia, who were like, that kind of literary analysis that form criticism offers us isn't particularly helpful for historical analysis. And so that's where form criticism began to fall apart, is as a historical tool, not as a literary tool.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, and that was an excellent explanation. I want to come back to the methods of form criticism because you address this in the chapter, like how we have to. There are things we can learn from form criticism that are still valuable for understanding the historical Jesus, but we also need to develop methodologies that aren't dependent upon the assumptions of form criticism. But before we do that, you talk about the period of oral tradition in between the life of the historical Jesus and the Gospels, and I think that this is the thing that maybe a lot of people have a hard time understanding. There is, a gap between when Jesus lived and when the Gospels were written, and both form criticism as well as social memory theory and oral tradition theory and all of that is designed to analyze that period of time, that gap between the life of Jesus and when the texts that we have in the Gospels were produced. So maybe talk as a form of ancient media about the role of oral tradition. How would oral tradition function in that culture, and what does that tell us about the period of time between Jesus and the Gospels?
Yeah, and here I have to acknowledge, Alex, I have a little bit of discomfort, even though oral tradition really is kind of my field. I have a little discomfort with the emphasis on oral tradition, because when we talk about oral tradition, we're really just talking about a medium of communication. What we're doing here, well, it's electronic, but it's also very oral. I'm not texting you and you're texting me back. We're talking. It's one medium of communication. It's not the best medium. It's not the worst medium. In fact, there isn't best and worst. There's just strengths and weaknesses. So texting, if you and I were texting, or before, we were emailing, that had certain strengths and offered us certain opportunities for communication, but it also had some limitations. That's why we're not doing this by email. And as I said before, we don't have one syllable of early oral Jesus tradition, not one. So we can't analyze any of it. We can analyze 21st century oral Jesus tradition if I wanted to be an anthropologist and go somewhere to a culture and just listen to the way people in Central Asia talk about Jesus, or the way the people in Manhattan talk about Jesus, and analyze not what they write about Jesus, but just how they talk about Jesus. I can do these things, but we can't do them for the early Christians. So oral tradition has really gone inaccessible to us. But what I think is more important is the idea of tradition, right? More than oral tradition is the idea of tradition. The idea that these things are handed down. That's what tradition means, that things are handed down to us, and that they're repetitive. They happen regularly. And so when I'm hearing a story, it's not the first time I'm hearing it, and I'm hearing it with certain expectations because I've heard this story before. It's actually not as foreign as we might think, because we do this all the time. If I go to and I didn't, but if I go to a Taylor Swift concert, I'm not hearing most of these songs for the first time because I've got 2 daughters. I've heard most of these songs before. And so when I hear the phrase, I've got nothing in my brain, I know what's coming next because I've heard Shake It Off a million times. And so as she's singing it, I've got certain expectations for what's coming next. Now, if she diverges from that, I'll pick up on that. I'll be like, oh, she's added a new verse, or she didn't sing a verse, or she's made a medley and she's combining Shake It Off with, I'm actually running up against the limits of my Taylor Swift knowledge.
Yeah, me too.
But my experience with the tradition of Taylor Swift affects how I am receiving the event of of performance. And I think that's how, that is how I want to encourage people to read the Gospels, is that these aren't just flat two-dimensional texts that we can read and we see the same thing as we read these texts that say Matthew would have seen as he wrote them, or that Matthew's earliest readers would have seen as he wrote them. Matthew's original hearers would have been more like the fans at a Taylor Swift concert, where they hear some Pharisees and Sadducees came up to Jesus to test him, and they asked him and they began to ask him, and they just hear the beginning of a story, and they know, I know where this goes. I know what's coming next. And maybe they have their expectations met completely. Oh, I love that story, and Matthew told it really well. Or maybe they have their expectations subverted. Oh, he told that story really interestingly. He did. Oh, I'd never thought about that. Or maybe this is a possibility. Maybe he tells the story wrong. Maybe he tells the story and everybody goes, "That's not how that story goes." That's completely wrong. But the point is, there is a tradition. There is a common understanding that everybody knows what's going on here. None of this is new. None of this is for the first time. Contrast this with, this morning I woke up, and as I was getting ready for the day, I put the news on, and I'm hearing stories for the first time. Here's a story that happened in New Orleans. Here's a story that happened in Las Vegas. Here are new laws that are happening in 20. These are brand new things. And I'm receiving that information very differently than I would receive the information of sitting in a seat or standing in front of a seat at a Taylor Swift concert. And what I want to suggest is thinking about ancient media helps us to see the Gospels much more like the information we receive at a Taylor Swift concert, and much less like the information I receive watching a CNN show.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think that there were a lot of form critics that had the assumption that the Gospels, if you analyze them through the lens of form criticism, would be more like the CNN show, that we can get that kind of hard data from there. But you also kind of argue in your chapter that there are a lot of presuppositions that were built into form criticism that turned out to be completely untrue, but that there are still some valuable historical methods that we could take from form criticism. So maybe talk about that dynamic a little bit. Where did that method of trying to analyze the media behind the Jesus tradition get it wrong? And then how might it also help us develop methods that we can use in the future?
Mm-hmm. So one of the claims of form criticism, or one of the observations that the form critics made, was that that so much of the Jesus tradition was particularly useful and appropriate for later settings in the early Christian community. Right. This particular way of telling the story of Jesus healing the paralytic who was lowered from the ceiling served an argumentative or polemical purpose, as Jesus is dealing with some scribes or some Pharisees who are saying, "Why does this man talk this way? He's blaspheming." And so, since it serves Christian purposes, let me just keep it there. It serves Christian purposes, later Christian purposes. That's a good observation. Where I think the form critics really began to go astray is when they made the kind of naive assumption that if a form of the Jesus tradition served early Christian purposes, that form was created by those early Christian purposes. And so I think there are two problems. One is there's no direct link between a tradition's use and the generation, the formation, the creation of that tradition. Just because a tradition is useful doesn't mean that's where it comes from. I mean, that's just a false connection. But I think that the problem is actually more fundamental. The form critics didn't go far enough. The form critics were willing to say that certain stories in the Gospels did not serve later Christian purposes. Like probably the most famous one is that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. John comes proclaiming a baptism of repentance. Later Christians think that Jesus is sinless and has no need of repentance. And so If the Gospels tell us that Jesus was baptized by John in the Jordan River, that does not serve early Christian purposes. The point that I would make is that every single word in the Gospels serves a later Christian function. That doesn't mean it's created by that. That doesn't mean it's early Christians needed a Jesus who was baptized by John, and so they created that image. It just means that if it didn't matter to them, they wouldn't have told us. There's so much that we don't know about Jesus. We're not even certain when he was born. We make certain guesses based on when Herod died and the age of the children that he killed, which is really interesting because most historians don't even think that the story of Herod killing the children in Bethlehem is historical, but we're willing to peg our estimates on when Jesus was born on this story that very many of us don't think happened. We're not even certain when he died, what day of the week was it? What year was it? All of that. There's so many things we don't know, and we don't know them because the earliest Christians felt no need to tell us these things. It didn't serve their purposes to tell us these things. So I want to recognize that the form critics were right. We can't read the Gospels and say, well, the reason that Mark 14 records Jesus calling God Abba, Father, is because Jesus called God Abba. That's why it records it. No, Mark is doing something. Jesus may have called God Abba. I'm not saying he didn't, but it also serves Mark's purposes to preserve that Aramaic address. And how do I know that? Well, because Matthew and Luke don't record that Jesus said Abba. They get rid of it. It doesn't matter to them. Are they saying that Jesus never called God Abba? No, they're not necessarily saying that, but they just didn't need to record it. And since they didn't need to record it, I think we need to recognize Mark didn't have to record it. There's nothing, oh, Jesus said this, I better write it down. There's nothing like that, but it served Mark's interests. It was good for Mark to do. And so the form critics are right. Every word from the Gospels serves a later purpose, a purpose from the years 60, 70, 80, 90, 100, whatever. But that doesn't undermine our, I don't want to say faith here because that word gets so confusing. It doesn't undermine the possibility that these things written in these texts have some historical value. But the form critics really did think that if it serves a Christian purpose, it must be created by that purpose. And so I think we've got to divide those two insights. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And that's one of the things that, as you talk about the way that ancient media actually functions in your chapter, there are just a couple of considerations that we have to revise. And one of those that you address directly is the idea that there's an original version of any of these pericopes in the gospel. And so I think a great example of this would be like the parable of the sower. Yeah. So for a lot of form critics, and I think that there would even be a lot of kind of like maybe educated lay observers within the church that would look at the Gospels and think, okay, so there's a difference between the way that Mark tells the story of the parable of the sower and the way that Matthew and Luke tell the story of the parable and the sower, or I'm sorry, tell the parable of the sower. So the question is, like, which one is the more original version? And you make the argument that if we take the way that ancient media works into consideration, that might not even be the right question. So maybe talk about that dynamic there, why there's not necessarily an original version to any of the stories that are contained in our written gospel.
Yeah, I think that's right, and really, and I think this will be a helpful point to have for later in our conversation. The issue is caused by which direction are we asking the questions? Are we starting with the Gospels and trying to move backwards to understanding Jesus? What happens if we start with Jesus and try to explain the Gospels? And so, we're trying to ask questions in these two different directions. The form critics would take kind of an evolutionary view of the tradition. That if we look at the tradition in its earliest, in the earliest moment we have it, which might be the Gospel of Mark, or might be this document that we call Q, that a lot of people think Matthew and Luke had access to. If we look at it at the tradition in its earliest moment, and then we look at it at later visible moments, here it is in Mark, here it is in Matthew, here it is in Luke, here it is in John, and if we can see here's how that story develops, then we can analyze all right, if this is what the story looks like when Mark wrote and Matthew wrote and Luke wrote, if this is how the story looks then, can we kind of place a ruler on it and postulate earlier moments of that? And so, oh, look, Mark says this, and then Matthew drops. He has this habit of dropping names and dropping unnecessary words. Luke does that even more. And so I bet the early story had more names, had more words that we would say are unnecessary or whatnot. And so we would look at parallel versions of the same story, maybe for the sake of simplicity, look at the first beatitude. In Matthew, it's blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens. And in Luke, it's blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. And so we can look at these and we can say, all right, what are the differences? Which one is likely to be earlier? Which one's likely to be later? And then apart from these two versions, Matthew 5:3 and Luke 6:17, 6:19, apart from these two versions, what do we think existed before them? What is it that Jesus was likely to have said on that day when he stood or sat up on a mountain or a level place? The problem from a media perspective actually begins even before we deal with media, with oral tradition or other kinds of tradition. The problem is, why do we think Jesus only said, blessed are poor people once?
Right.
And if he said it more than once, why do we think Jesus says, okay, I've said this before, I better say it exactly the same way? That's just not how we use language, right? I have told my wife and my children I love them probably thousands of times over the course of our life together, and often it's just this: "Hey, I love you." Often I have other ways of saying it. I may add a modifier: "I love you very much." Or sometimes I might insert a little sarcasm. I love you just a little tiny bit. And that creates a smile. There are different ways of saying the same thing. So why do we think that Jesus could only have said, blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God? And that other versions must be later evolutions of that saying? Why do we think that Jesus couldn't have said the same thing in different ways? Well, once you ask the question that way, I think any honest historian needs to acknowledge, of course, Jesus could have said things in different ways. And if he says things in different ways, then what that means is from the very beginning, before we have early Christians, early followers of Jesus, repeating what Jesus said, from the very beginning, when Jesus is still the one doing the talking, we have multiple forms of sayings. Or if he's doing certain things, of course, he probably only, if we can make some assumptions here, he probably only healed Jairus' daughter once. I doubt this was like, my daughter's sick again, Jesus, would you mind coming by? She's died again. Could you, these things happen only once. But, he's known for casting out demons. He's known for healing people with skin diseases. He's known for healing the blind. If he does something once, he does them multiple times. And so what you get are kind of accounts that reflect the multiple iterations of each of these things, not just one thing. So from the very beginning, there is no original form of a particular story. From the very beginning, there are, this is a technical term, but we call them multiforms, right? That sometimes it looks like this, sometimes it looks like this, sometimes it looks like this, but they're all the same thing, And then it just gets more complicated from there. And then you get later Christians talking about, well, remember when Jesus says this? And Mark may have his favorite way of telling those stories. Matthew may have his. So it just gets more and more complicated. That complexity doesn't mean we can't know anything about Jesus. It doesn't mean that. The complexity just means we can't boil it down to a simple, Jesus must have said this one thing this one time. We can't do that. That doesn't exist.
Yeah, and that was really the problem with the Jesus Seminar, which you address in your book too. And that's not to take away from the fact that all of those guys were extremely brilliant, but there was this sense with the Jesus Seminar, and it was the entire process that they had on voting on which words in which each individual pericopes actually went back to the historical Jesus. And if you look at their critical edition of the Gospels, it's like they would, there'd be a statement in one of the Gospels that was purportedly made by Jesus, and there would be 2 words that would be highlighted in pink or red. certifying that Jesus definitely said these two words, but the rest of them not so much.
Yeah.
That's just not the way the ancient media worked, and we shouldn't expect the Gospels to function that way. And I know that there have been throughout the last 2 millennia many Christians who are uncomfortable with the supposed discrepancies in the Gospels and have tried to resolve those. And really, a lot of the debate since the Enlightenment between people that are believers and people that are skeptics have been, well, look at all of the ways in which the Gospels diverge from one another. Obviously, this can't be historically true, but like you've been arguing, if you understand ancient media, that entire paradigm just doesn't work historically, right? That's just not the right way to conceptualize it.
That's right. And I want to acknowledge there is a problem that the Jesus Seminary and other historians are rightly reacting to, which is this idea. It's evident as early as the 2nd century in Christian history. This idea that, well, if Matthew says Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of the heavens," and Luke says Jesus said, "Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of God," he must have said both of those things. And so, and that's, we call this harmonization, that we're harmonizing the Gospels by saying Jesus said all of the things in the Gospels. I'm not making that point. I'm not saying that Jesus said both Matthew 5:3 and Luke 6:17 or 19. I'm not suggesting either of those things. What I'm suggesting is that apart from the Gospels, Jesus probably pronounced blessings on the poor dozens, hundreds of times regularly, and that what Matthew and Luke both offer us in their own way are portraits or images of Jesus issuing that pronouncement. Maybe sometimes he exactly said what Matthew has him saying in Greek. Maybe sometimes he says exactly what Luke has him saying in Greek. My suspicion is actually Jesus never said any of these words in Greek. He spoke in Aramaic. Yes. And so you already have interpretation from the very earliest moments of our data. So from that really picky level of historical analysis, did Jesus say the Greek words recorded in our manuscripts of Matthew's gospel? Maybe we can say, no, he didn't say those words. But from a broader historical lens, one that more of us are interested in, including the people you mentioned before, the people in your church, in the churches who are interested in these kinds of questions. With a broader historical lens, did Jesus pronounce blessing on the poor, or was he more likely to pronounce blessing on the bankers, on the rich, on the powerful, on the people who collected taxes, not because they were in some way despised or whatever, but because, oh, look, they're doing well. They have a lot of money. Look at how blessed they are. Was Jesus that kind of person? And from that broader view, I think both Matthew and Luke are offering us something historically true. Jesus was not remembered as saying, "Blessed are you Pharisees, blessed are you scribes." He was remembered as blessing other people and then pronouncing woe on Pharisees and scribes.
Do you think that the traditional criteria of authenticity have any value for understanding the historical Jesus? Because I know that that's kind of been a big theme with a lot of the scholars of the Next Quest, and a lot of people that I've interviewed over the last couple of weeks, like Chris Keith and James Crossley and Helen Bond. They've all been very concerned about those traditional methods. But I have a friend, Kevin Burr. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him or not, but he wrote a book that I just finished reading a couple of days ago called Authenticating the Criteria, where he says, like, okay, well, historians in general use criteria that are similar to the criteria that were employed by historical Jesus researchers. So maybe we do need to retain some of those historical criteria. What do you think about that dynamic? Because I know he brings up, Kevin Burr does, he brings up your work in that book as well. And I literally just finished it yesterday morning. So I wanted to ask you about like the role that you think these traditional criteria of authenticity play, given the reality of ancient media. Can we still use any of that, or do we have to move completely beyond that paradigm?
I like Kevin. I know him. He's a good guy. I will say this: I learned from watching Hamilton that you can't trust anyone named Burr. That's all I'm gonna. That's all I'm gonna say. It's interesting. I think they're broadly speaking two camps. They're the people who. Reaching back into scholarship from the mid to late 80s and the 90s through the 2000s, who say the criteria of authenticity are the tools, the historian's tools for knowing about Jesus, but we have to use them carefully. We have to use them critically. We have to use them judiciously. And if we do that, then we can know something about Jesus. And I'm actually not opposed to that group. I think they're wrong, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But I'm not opposed to that group because very often, particularly in the mid to late 80s through the 90s, the alternative was the view that they were arguing against, that people who were pitching criteria to us, the view that those people were arguing against was we can't know anything about Jesus. And so the criteria were really were often a way used by more optimistic historians. And we often divide these groups into theological categories. So we would say confessional historical Jesus scholars or more secular historical Jesus scholars. And I don't think that's necessarily helpful because it doesn't have to do so much with faith or lack of faith. It has more to do with a willingness to approach the sources optimistically, to say the text preserves some faithful account of the past as it was understood at the time that text was written, or more pessimistically, that these texts are actually less useful, more useless for understanding the past. And that was kind of the argument that was happening back then. Now, I think what's happening is that there are a number of us who say, as soon as you add adverbs to the use of criteria, you're already undermining them. So when you say we have to use the criteria judiciously, critically, carefully, you're already undermining what the criteria are meant to be. The criteria are meant to offer us scientific methods for knowing that Jesus did this thing or said this thing, and these things did not come from his later followers. So just like I can analyze the strength of the force of Earth's gravitational pull by measuring the falling objects, the rate of their acceleration, the force with which they hit the ground, or something like that, and I can do that objectively. And yay, gravity, and I think gravity is the strongest force in the universe, and I'm pro gravity, or I might be no, gravity sucks, and really want to undermine the influence of gravity. But look, I've timed the rate of fall, and an apple falling, from 6 feet, it takes this long to hit the ground, and from 12 feet takes this long, and the use of the criteria doesn't offer us anything like that. The use of the criteria are used to explain and justify decisions that are made on other grounds. Now, one last point, because I think often people think when someone like me or Chris Keith says we can't use the criteria, it means that we can't talk about embarrassment or multiple attestation or something like that. That's not the case either. The criteria have some historical insight. It's true that we all are products of a past that is sometimes inconvenient. Sometimes things happened in our history that we wish didn't happen, and we bear the scars of those things. Trauma theory is a huge topic of conversation right now, and at the heart of trauma theory is the idea that we can't just tell ourselves stories and act as if they're true. We're confronted by the truth of a past that we often wish didn't happen the way it did. That insight is at the heart of the criterion of embarrassment, that the early Christians were embarrassed by this idea, so they would not have made it up. Well, I sort of like that idea. I like the idea that the early Christians were not just free to make up a Jesus that they found useful, that they had to deal with facts from Jesus' life that they were uncomfortable with. But the problem is with the word criterion. That insight never lets me look at an actual text and say, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this claim was embarrassing to the early Christians, and so it must be true because they didn't make it up. That embarrassment always comes from imploding a historical claim within a broader story. That's kind of a weird thing to say. So let me just explain that, and then I'll we'll go from there. So it's often said, as I mentioned before, that the fact that the Gospels say Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist was an embarrassing thing for the earliest Christians. Oh, why was he baptized? Why did Jesus submit to a baptism of repentance if he was sinless? Aha! Here's something that the later Christians found embarrassing, and we can see how they wrestled with that embarrassment. Well, that's a whole historical narrative that provides some context for Jesus' baptism. The narrative of the early Christians thought Jesus was sinless. The narrative of Jesus was baptized by John, and then the narrative, the part of the story that says, "Well, wait, how do these two ideas fit together? That must be embarrassing." Other historians have told a different story. They've said John was a popular prophet. John was hugely influential. John drew massive crowds from all echelons of society. People traveled down from Jerusalem. Some of the most important people, scribes and Pharisees, according to Matthew, came down from Jerusalem to see John. If you were anybody in this day and age, you want to be associated with John, right? It would be like, hey, my biblical scholarship's so important that I opened for Taylor Swift. I got up and I shared about the historical Jesus before Tay-Tay came out and sang her and sang her song. You want to be associated with John. And so maybe we can tell a different historical narrative that early Christians told stories of Jesus being baptized because it linked Jesus with this incredibly influential figure. Now, I'm not saying that one of these is right, one of these is wrong. And in fact, I think both of those narratives have some key insights that we need to wrestle with. But the point has to do with, how does a criterion work? Does it give me something objective? And even people like Kevin Burr, who's an incredibly smart and insightful person, even he recognizes, no, it doesn't give us this objective thing. I still have to be careful with how I use these tools. So if you look at the way that I analyze specific actual texts from the Gospels, you'll see that I'm happy to run through the criterion of multiple attestation. Which texts tell us a story, and how are those texts related? Are they dependent or independent of each other? The criterion of embarrassment, which we've already talked about. What about the criterion of dissimilarity, which is a kind of a complex thing, and we can talk about that if you want to. I'm happy to run through those things, but then at the end of that, we don't have any historical facts. We just have some observations that we make about the tradition, and so we have to go from there.
Yeah, no, I think that was a really great description and counter to that. I guess to tie this all together, and the way that you bring your argument in the chapter of this book together is by taking a look at the temple scenes in the Gospels. And so I want to give you an opportunity to put a bow on all of this. How, based on your understanding of ancient media, should we read these temple texts in the Gospels? And then what does this tell us about our ability to analyze the historical Jesus? How does this all come together? And why did you decide to pick the temple? Of all of the issues that you could have chosen, why the temple, and what information does that give us based on your argument?
Yeah, let me start with that last part first. The temple plays such a huge role in Jesus' life and ministry. According to the Gospel of John, Jesus' public appearance really begins in the temple. He's already drawing crowds. He's already John the Baptist is sending his followers to Jesus, but he hasn't done anything public yet. He's turned some water into wine, but really only some servants know about this. And his first public appearance happens in the temple. In the other Gospels, Jesus' story kind of climaxes at the temple, if I can say that. Of course, it climaxes on the cross, but bracket that for a moment. It climaxes at the temple, and this is where the authorities in Jerusalem decide this guy has to die, and how are we going to do that? And then if I can talk about Mark's gospel, Jesus in the temple really takes place in chapters 11, 12, and 13, and then chapters 14 and 15 are all about, okay, some people did not like what Jesus did in the temple and what he said and all that. And so we need to put him to death. How's that going to happen? And those final chapters are about making that happen. And so the temple plays a really important role in Jesus' actual life and in our knowledge of that life. How do we ask questions about Jesus? What are the things that he did? What are the interactions that he had and all that? So the temple is hugely important. But one of the really interesting things about the Gospel's portrayal of Jesus and the temple is that there are some cross currents that are happening. So in Mark chapter 14, Jesus is being questioned by chief priests and some gathered members of the Sanhedrin. And they're trying to find testimony against him, but they can't get people to agree. And they're having these problems. Of course, you've got to find some coherent accusation to bring against Jesus if you're going to put him to death. And then Mark tells us that these two people stand up and they offer this false testimony. And the text emphasizes that this is false testimony. It's false. It's false. Falsity. False. 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 I mean, that's how Mark is portraying it here. And what do they say? They say, "We heard this man get up and say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will raise another not made with hands.'" And then Mark tells us, even here, their testimony didn't agree. We're going to find the same claim them echoed in the next chapter, in chapter 15, as Jesus is nailed to the cross. He's not dead yet, but he's suspended there on the cross, and passersby are walking, witnessing this and taunting Jesus, shaking their head and going, "You who would destroy the temple and build it again in 3 days, come down so that we may see and believe in all this." And so there's this claim that Jesus' adversaries, his opponents, are telling us, this guy said he was going to take the temple down. And there's an emphasis that all of this is false. At the same time, I have this other uncomfortable text, the Gospel of John, where Jesus overturns tables in the temples and whatnot, and the Jews in the temple say, "Who do you think you are? Why are you doing this?" And Jesus responds to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it." That sounds a lot like what Mark claimed was false testimony. So what are we to make of this? And again, it kind of comes back to that: do we approach our text optimistically or pessimistically? Those of us who are more pessimistic would say, that sounds like Jesus really did threaten the temple, and Mark is trying to let Jesus off the hook here. Mark is trying to say, no. He didn't say that. That's a misunderstanding. No. I mean, he said something but no, that's not what he was saying. And then those of us who are more optimistic would try and preserve. No, this is clearly a false claim, or at least for Mark, it's definitely portrayed as false. And so we have to ask the question: why does he portray it as false? What I want to say, observed as I was looking at these texts was what nobody contests, what nobody debates, is that Jesus pronounced threats about the temple. I mean, even Mark, who insists the claim that Jesus says, "I will destroy this temple and made with hands, and in 3 days build another not made with hands," who insists that claim is false. Even Mark tells us that Jesus said to his disciples, "Do you see these buildings? Not one stone will be left on another." I mean, even Mark is willing to tell us Jesus clearly declared the temple is under judgment and going to be destroyed. And so what is it specifically about this claim that Mark thinks is false? Well, I think what it is it's that first person claim. I will destroy this temple. And when I look at John and I see that even in John chapter 2, Jesus doesn't say, "I will destroy this temple." He says, "You destroy this temple and I will build it again in 3 days." Of course, the people there in the temple are incredulous. They're like, "What? It's taken 46 years to build this place. You're gonna do it in 3 days?" And then John does this misunderstanding thing. They didn't understand. He was talking about the temple of his body. But in all of these things, what we can see is how the interpretive forces at work in the text, as Mark is trying to portray Jesus as this innocent guy who's being railroaded by the temple authorities, and John is trying to paint. He's doing other interpretive things. He's trying to portray Jesus as this misunderstood figure who says really enigmatic things, and people think they understand, but they really don't. They have these different interpretive agendas, but they're how do I want to say? Our goal is not to strip away those interpretive agendas and see Jesus as he actually was. Our goal, our task is to see how these interpretive agendas actually bring Jesus to us, so that these are the reasons why we can know anything at all about Jesus. We don't need to get behind the Gospels to understand who was Jesus before his followers got their hands on him and corrupted him. They're getting their hands on Jesus is why we know anything at all. If they had not had a reason to tell us anything about Jesus, he would be as anonymous to us. He would be as unknown to us as any of the dozens, hundreds, thousands of other people who were crucified by Roman and Jewish authorities in the first centuries BCE and CE. And so I'm trying to get at how do the interpretive tendencies of our earliest sources actually make it possible for us to know something about Jesus, rather than how do they create problems or roadblocks to our knowledge?
Yeah, no, I think that was a beautiful explanation. I got one more question about ancient media I want to ask you before we start to wrap up today, and that is, do you believe in the existence of Q? Because I am, and I know that's a huge question. I'm a huge fan of Mark Goodacre. I think I've listened to every single episode of his NT pod like 2 or 3 times, and he really convinced me when I was in Bible college that Q didn't exist. But then last year I read Alan Kirk's new book on that, and I think he made some very compelling arguments for why we should assume that Q exists. But given that your articles about ancient media and you've thought about this, where do you stand on that issue?
Yeah. I'm going to dodge.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm a Q skeptic. I am a Q skeptic, but I'm not anti-Q. So often I think Q skepticism often, and this does not apply to Mark Goodacre, who is an incredibly careful and insightful scholar. Often Q skepticism, I think, is masking a preference for Matthew and Luke. I prefer Matthew and Luke, and you messing up Matthew and Luke and suggesting there's a source behind them it isn't particularly helpful. I'm not persuaded that Q had to have existed, and I'm not persuaded that it did exist. But I also don't have a problem with there were probably written sources that we don't have anymore. And if our early authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, had those sources, then that's what we would be talking about here. So what I think is incredibly valuable about Mark Goodacre's work is that he has made it respectable to approach the gospel texts from a different angle. Before Mark Goodacre and Michael Gooder, you really had to analyze the synoptic gospels from the lens of what comes from Mark, what comes from Q, what's only in Matthew, what's only in Luke. And Mark Goodacre comes along and says, or we could look at it from this other angle, and these other insights come up. Now, they're not drastically different. It's not like if you believe in Q, Jesus blesses the poor, and if you don't believe in Q, Jesus blesses the Pharisees. They're not radically different, but they are distinct. And as historians, I think what we should be doing is analyzing all of these scenarios and then saying, now what we have is kind of here's the range of historical possibilities that our sources allow us to postulate. This is what the early Jesus tradition looked like. If Q existed, we think this. If Q didn't exist and Luke was using Mark and Matthew, then we think this. And the truth is probably somewhere in that spectrum. And I think the ongoing nature of Q scholarship, particularly Alan Kirk's work, is incredibly insightful. I'm not persuaded by parts of it because he's more confident in Q's existence than I am. But yeah, I love the current state of our discipline, which just says, we're not sure, so let's try and understand all of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a beautiful way to wrap that up. The final question that I have for you today is just the future of Jesus scholarship in general. So given the fact that the Next Quest is a concerted effort to try to ask different questions about the nature of the historical Jesus and what kind of information the Gospels can give us and a bunch of issues related to reception and things of that nature, where do you see the field of New Testament scholarship in 20 to 30 years? Which is, I know, an impossible question.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and I refer to pessimism and optimism, and historically speaking, I'm generally a pretty optimistic person. Here's the one place where I think my pessimism will come through, which is to say, I don't think there's a lot of new things to say about the historical Jesus. So I think a lot of the excesses in Jesus scholarship, both of the pessimistic kind that doesn't trust our sources or have a lot of confidence in our sources' historical value, and also in the more optimistic kind that has more confidence in the historical value. But the excesses of both of these is partially motivated by our desire as scholars to say something new.
Right.
We've got to publish books. Our employers, our tenure review committees need us to say new things. Now, I don't want to be completely dismissive, but the fact is, even stuff that's happening now in the mid 2020s, when you go back and read, when you read D.F. Strauss, when you read Albert Schweitzer, when you read T.W. Manson, scholars of previous generations, there's a lot that's outdated. It's true, and there's a lot that they say that we wouldn't say today. That's true, and then there's a lot where it's like, holy cow, that's exactly what I argued in this essay that I published that I thought was groundbreaking, but actually somebody was saying it back in 1886, and so what I think is going to again, this is kind of more pessimistic than I'm comfortable being, but it is what I suspect. I think 20 to 30 years from now, we're still going to be arguing about these things, and what that persistent argument tells us is that Jesus matters. And not just for faith, not just for people of faith, that's obvious, but Jesus matters in a broader cultural way, in a broader academic way. If he didn't matter, we would stop talking about him. Yeah. But he matters. And so we're going to continue to localize a lot of our debates in the figure of Jesus. And honestly, I think as a Christian, I think that's a good thing. We should be arguing about who we think Jesus is, because again, as a Christian, I think this guy matters, right. And so I like that. I like that people are coming to the discussion. People that I disagree with, they help me. They help me to hone why I think the things that I do. But also, and this will be maybe the last thing to say, they also teach me things. And sometimes I have to stand in front of somebody who doesn't believe in Jesus and go, "Man, that was a good point." And I've got a blind spot there. I've got to deal with that. And I think the church is only well served by that. So you'll notice this is my pessimism. It ends on an optimistic note.
Yes. Hey, well, Dr. Rafael Rodriguez, that was beautiful. I really enjoyed our conversation today. Before I let you go, where can people find your work and or follow you? How can people get in contact with you?
Yeah, I have an anemic social media presence. So I'm on Facebook, like other old people. And so if you got on Facebook to keep in touch with your grandparents, you can find me there. But also here I am in Pittsburgh at the Theological Seminary. If you're in the area, look me up. If you're thinking about pursuing a master's divinity or thinking about doing PhD studies, whatever, come join us here at Pittsburgh. And I've got a piece coming out soon on the reception of John's Gospel by historians of Jesus, and I've got another piece coming out soon on the reception of John the Baptist in the Gospel of John. So those are places where people can find my forthcoming work.
All right. Well, Dr. Rafael Rodriguez, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Alex. I appreciate you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.